afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for coming out this afternoon and helping us celebrate the end of our celebratory year of 75 years of White Mountain Research Center. My name is Galen Kinsey, and I'm the scheduling coordinator here at WMRC, and I will be introducing this afternoon's speaker. First, I would like to give a land acknowledgement. The White Mountain Research Center acknowledges the Numu, Paiute, Shoshone as the first peoples and traditional land stewards of Paiute and Kohotoya, the Owens Valley White Mountains. As the facility managed by a land grant institution, we pay our respects to the Mahadubu and Humu of past, present, and emerging generations. And just some housekeeping items, we will be recording this talk and it will be posted on our YouTube channel at a later date. I remind everybody to please silence your cell phones, and there will be a Q&A section at the end of the talk. This afternoon, Daniel Pritchett, our WMRS or WMRC historian, will be presenting on the early history of the center. And I'm not going to read out the whole title. With that being said, the helm is yours, Daniel. Thank you. I don't have these on.
Okay, I'll have to get used to this microphone for a second. The first time I spoke on this lecture series was sometime in the early 2000s, and this is the first time we've had this nifty microphone set up. So again, let me know if it's not working or if I need to speak louder.
You sound great from here.
Yeah, you sound great.
Okay, I'm used to trying to not have a microphone and project my voice, but since it seems to be working, I'll not worry about projecting so much. To begin with, I want to thank Stephen for inviting me to speak. It's certainly an honor to be part of the celebration of the 75th anniversary. Before I get started, I want to go over the terminology briefly. I will be referring to the research center as the research station during my talk out of force of habit, because that's what we called it when I worked here. They only changed the name to center in 2012. And up until that it was station, and also station had several meanings. You would refer to individual facilities as stations, like Warcroft Station and Crooked Creek Station, but we also referred to the whole enterprise, including all these facilities, as White Mountain Research Station. So that's the double meaning of the word station that I will be using. To start, before I start talking about the actual history of WMRS, I want to remind everyone that Western science came to the White Mountains a long time before the University of California and White Mountain Research Station did. Here's a brief listing of some of the noteworthy scientists who came to the Whites here, and the main point is these scientists were all coming to the Whites for the sake of the Whites. They were interested in the topography, the geology, the botany, and the zoology. These are Shockley and Miriam and Walcott were some of the prominent natural scientists of the late 1800s. And they all had come to the White Mountains long before anybody thought about building a research station here. Also, I want to point out that we had our own White Mountain silver excitement here that's been pretty much forgotten about in the 1860s. And in fact, I would love to give a talk about that. I have in the past, but there's not time today. But there is an article I wrote, Journal of the West. So if any would like to hear more about that, I'm kind of looking. Stephen said there was
I'm going to grab one. Keep going.
a laser pointer somewhere. Anyway, I do have one, here it is. Am I have a laser pointer? Let me find this. There we go. Okay, so there's the citation if you're interested. It's in Journal of the West, and it's a great story, so I highly recommend if you're interested in history of the area, read about the White Mountain voter fraud of 1861. Now, we skip ahead to 1929, that's when the action really begins, because that's when people had the idea not to come to the whites for the sake of the whites, but because on the whites they could get atmospheric conditions that were really good for astronomy. At high elevations, the air was thin because of this high elevation, and because of the rain shadow effect of the Sierra, the air is also very dry. And so two people from Caltech are given credit with having the idea originally. Fritz Zwicky, who was quite a character apparently, and Iris Sprague Bowen on the left. But they apparently were scooped by just a bunch of locals here. We see this newspaper article that it was the High Sierra Recreation Association held a field trip to the summit of White Mountain Peak, it says, in this newspaper article, with the idea of sighting the Mount Palomar telescope there, because in the late 20s, that was a big thing. They were worried about they were building this world's largest telescope, and White Mountain was a serious candidate. It didn't get it, it went to Mount Palomar, as it turned out, but this was the first time White Mountain was considered for the site of the world's largest telescope. This happened again in the 1970s. Now, we skip ahead to 1943, World War II has started, and the scientists at Caltech in Pasadena were doing their contribution to the war effort by developing jet and rocket engines. And they initially did this in Eaton Canyon, which is right by Pasadena, but they needed more space. And they actually had someone killed trying to do this rocket testing in Eaton Canyon. So this was the origin then of the Inyo-Kern Naval Ordnance Test Station, which very quickly became a very high-powered scientific center for the study of rocket engines and jets. And so by 1943, the Navy and Caltech had collaborated to build the Naval Ordnance Test Station at Inyo-Kern, which we're looking at here. And these scientists very shortly decided they wanted a high elevation site. So this is one of the origins of White Mountain Research Station, the scientists from Caltech and the Naval Ordnance Test Station. Now, during World War II, the plot thickens, so I'm going to be introducing a couple of more threads to the story here. First, we have a physiologist from UC Berkeley named Nello Pace, and he had just graduated when war broke out, so he enlisted in the Naval Reserve, and he got stationed in Bethesda, Maryland, where he was assigned to a small group of researchers who were delegated the task of establishing a Naval Military Research Institute in Bethesda. And in that small group of researchers also was a man named William Consolatio. And he became good friends with Nello because Consolatio, like Nello, was from an Italian immigrant family. In fact, Italian was Consolatio's first language. His grandson gave us his unpublished autobiography, which had a lot of interesting details about the founding of the research station. But I could give a whole talk on his biography. He used to help his father peddle produce on the streets of Boston while behind a horse-drawn cart. And then when he was in high school, he somehow got a job working at a lab at Harvard, cleaning glassware. And then when World War II broke out, he had worked his way up so he could enlist in the Navy, and they assigned him to working in the lab with Mello Pace. And the center person in the slide, John Lawrence, also, when World War II broke out, he enlisted in the Army, not the Navy, but he was trained as a physician. He was the brother of Ernest Lawrence, for whom the Lawrence Labs were named at Berkeley. And Lawrence was interested in working on the problem of high altitude physiology, which was a very relevant problem in these days, because they had just developed airplanes that could go up to high altitudes, but they weren't pressurized. And so pilots would black out and crash their planes. So this was a real problem at the time. And Pace, of course, was interested in analogous issue, bends, which Navy divers would get if they dove down to low depths, but then ascended too quickly, they'd get the bends. And Pace and Lawrence met each other in World War II and realized they were working on different aspects of the same problem. And so they got to be good friends. Excuse me, do we have some water? I'm dehydrated. Is there just a glass of water or something? Yeah, thank you. So we've gotten World War II started, and we've gotten the Naval Ordnance Test Station started, and we've gotten Mello Pace meeting John Lawrence, and they're also friends with William Consolatio. Now, a lot happens in a short period of time, in the next couple of years. First, we have the Office of Naval Research, which was established in 1946 as a precursor to the National Science Foundation, because it took Congress several years to actually agree on how to set up the National Science Foundation. So in the meantime, they set up the Office of Naval Research. And William Consolatio jumped ship from the Navy, from setting up the Naval Marine Research Institute in Bethesda. He took a job at the Office of Naval Research as the director of the biochemistry program, meaning his job would be to basically give out research funds related to biochemistry. Now, 1 year later, Mello Pace got his own personal research contract from the Office of Naval Research. It was entitled Distribution of Gases, Water, and Electrolytes in the Human Body. And this, we'll see, was interpreted very broadly. And 1947, then Pace had this research grant, but he was a free agent. He had been in the military, but he didn't have a lab in which to do his research. So he contacted his good friend John Lawrence, who happened to be the director of the Donner Lab at UC Berkeley. And I think I mentioned that Lawrence was the brother of Ernest Lawrence, who got the Nobel Prize for inventing the cyclotron. And he had set up the Donner Lab and specialized in nuclear medicine, which was cutting edge at the time. And 1947 and 1948, we know from Consolatio's autobiography that Pace visited him at his home in Bethesda, and Pace was looking through a copy of National Geographic and saw an article about mountains in the West, and told Consolatio, by golly, let's go ahead and let's do it. They had talked about starting a high altitude research lab during the war. Thank you. And so, thanks to Consolatio, we actually know when they had the idea, and it was at his house in Bethesda, Maryland. And the plan was for Nello to go back to California, where he had not only had a lab, but he had also joined the faculty at Berkeley, and find a place, decide where to put this lab. And Consolatio would worry about getting funding, since he worked at a funding agency. It made perfect sense. Now, 1948, yet another thread. I said a lot of things. What did I just do? Okay, a lot of things happened in a short period of time. We have the first known count of bristlecone pine rings. And this photo gives an attribution. It says it's from the Forest Service, and the count was made in 1948. And is presumably the most likely suspect was Al Morin, who worked for the Forest Service as the district ranger at that point. But we don't know for sure who made the counts. But because this photo actually wasn't published until 1976. But in any case, here is the beginnings of bristlecone counting rings research in whites. Okay. Okay. The same year, Al Noren also discovered what he termed, or was officially termed, the champion bristlecone, which got named the Patriarch. And that was a champion because its diameter was the largest anyone had found. Is this blurry, or is it just my glasses?
It's a little blurry.
Oh, could you try to fix
Yeah, I
it?
can try.
I think it could be better than that. Anyway, I'll continue the story here. So we have the champion bristlecone, and we know from the people are starting.
There you go.
Yeah.
Pages. Okay. And also in 1948, yet another thread to the story, the Naval Ordnance Test Site scientists at Inyokern say, we want an observatory at a high elevation, and White Mountains would be the perfect site for it. And this was entirely unknown to Noah Case and his physiology colleagues. This was all about astronomy and physics of the night sky. So that was the reason that the Naval Ordnance Test Site came to Crooked Creek. And oops. That's kind of okay. What's happening? Okay. So August 3rd, 1948, they sent researchers from Aerojet, which is a military industrial contractor, the Office of Naval Research, and the Carnegie Institute, and they camped at Crooked Creek. And this is a recent photo of Jean Blanc's old cabin. It's hard to recognize, but this is the remains of the fireplace of the, and the chimney there. And we also have some historic photos. So this is what Crooked Creek looked like. These are the roof beams, these black dots. It's a tilted roof there, and that is actually the roof. It's rocks and brush and wood there, and it's a dugout, so you step down to go in it. But this is what it looked like in 1921, and this is also, notice, this is a meadow, no doubt about it. And nowadays, it's totally converted into sagebrush shrubland. This is what it was there from a couple of years ago. So we have some more photos from here. This was the sheep corral that John Blanc had built right next to his cabin is just around to the right, just behind this ridge right there. And these must have been beautiful bristlecone hand-hewn logs and limber pine actually, so there's a lot of limber mixed in. And then, of course, what happened, by the time the Navy came along, the logs had disappeared, and I strongly suspect they were cannibalized by the Golden Siren Mine, which is just behind this ridge in the Poison Creek drainage, just behind Crooked Creek here. So now that's a bit of a digression, but by December 1948, the Naval Ordnance Test Station had bulldozed the road all the way up to the current site of Barcroft, and on above it, this is White Mountain Peak in the background there. And these are two trailers in which they did astronomic research here, cosmic radiation, I should say. That was the cutting edge at the time, and at high altitude. And so this is from 1949, and this is the living quarters at Crooked Creek in 1949. So the people would spend the night there at 10:05 or so, and then drive on up past the site of current Crooked Creek and use those trailers for their cosmic radiation research. And this was their weather state, the site where they did weather observations. Notice that it looks like Barcroft. That's because it is. It's just like it's a smaller scale version of a Quonset hut. And this is on the ridge above the living quarters, which are just right down here. But they had a fire in 1953 or 1954, I don't remember which, and burnt down completely. But they did a good job with the cleanup, as we can see. This is the site of the old net hut. Now, 1949, we're still in 1949. Pace and Cook is co-author of this proposal, S.F. Cook, who was his colleague in the physiology department at Berkeley, who was a senior and well-known. Pace was the new kid on the block. He had just gotten in the physiology department, but he got Cook to join with him and persuaded him to make this proposal for a station at higher elevation, and this would be at Barcroft, up at 12.5. And they had a proposal. The important elements were that they'd have a contract between the Office of Naval Research and a small group of research. Research would be funded by individual research contracts from ONR, and there'd be a director to keep track of everything. And they cited as an example the Naval Arctic Research Lab, which is shown here in the bottom. And this is the exact same as Barcroft. It was the same size Quonset hut, only it was up in Point Barrow, Alaska. So this was the model for Barcroft. And so 1949, then we know from Consolatio's autobiography that he and Nello had decided to proceed to build a high altitude research station, and Pace was in charge of choosing the site. So he went back to Berkeley, and his first choice was, of course, Mount Whitney, because they already had a small stone cabin there. And Pace was able to get permission from the Park Service to use this as a research site. But then David Brower, who you may have heard of, is a big environmental activist, heard about it and said, wait just a minute, this is Mount Whitney. We, the Sierra Club, don't think this is such a good idea. but you should consider White Mountain Peak as an alternative. It's just about as high as Mount Whitney, and so, David Brower threatened to go to the president of UC about this, which really upset Nello, but Nello agreed if he thinks it's worth trying. He went up there, he went first to Mount Whitney and looked at it, and then shortly after, in July 1949, climbed the summit of White Mountain Peak. And this is an entry from the White Mountain Peak Summit Register, where we can see that Nello climbed it with Will Siri, who was one of his colleagues from the Donner Lab at Berkeley, who was a mountain climber. And he climbed it and decided, yeah, this is a much better site. The terrain is much more forgiving as far as getting up there. So this is how they hit upon White Mountain Research Station. This is also from the White Mountain Summit Register, and you can see that they have a guy named Ned Goldwasser there, who was an astronomer, and notice at the bottom, he said, in the near future, there'll be a cosmic ray research station on the summit. Sheep Mountain isn't good enough. Now, we just happen to have a photo from just over that time from Sheep Mountain, and this is what he was talking about. They would have been trying to do cosmic ray research from Sheep Pass, which is this photo. And of course, they cleaned this one up well also. 1949, yet another thread in the tapestry. There's three photos of people in this picture. First, we have Neil Rahm, who was the supervisor of Inyo National Forest. And we have Al Noren, who was the district ranger in Inyo National Forest for the White Mountain District. Now, Al Noren had been telling people, these bristlecones look like they're really, really old. And he discovered, did I already show that slide? He discovered the patriarch.
Mm-hmm.
And that was recognized as the champion bristlecone, officially called the champion bristlecone by the Foresters Association. But we also have Al Noren's son left us some recollections, and he said, well, his dad sent a cross-section of a bristlecone off to UC Berkeley in 1949. Now, we also have Al Noren's wife, who said he sent a cross-section of bristlecone to UC Berkeley in 1949. The problem is that in 1949, UC Berkeley did not have any kind of tree ring lab to receive it. And so we don't know for sure who received this cross-section of bristlecone pine, but somehow someone at Berkeley sent it to a guy named Waldo S. Block, who was a well-known tree ring specialist at the time. Block had been a student of A.E. Douglas, who was really the father of dendrochronology at the University of Arizona. But there was a schism among the tree ring researchers, and Block and others said, you don't understand enough about the physiology of how tree rings are formed. And so Glock was not worried about trying to make tree ring chronologies as Douglas and Schulman, as we will see in a minute, were. But years later, Glock wrote this letter to the Inyo National Forest and said, okay, I need to get mine, here we go. In 1949, the University of California sent me a segment of a bristlecone pine and found it to be of excessive age based on ring counts. But however, a ring count and age and years may be two different things, because Locke was one of the parties of the schism that said, wait, we don't know enough about how tree rings form to be able to just assume this is one ring for every year. And he found in his research in the tropics, there were trees that produced multiple rings per year, because apparently it's the cold season that triggers a recognizable ring. And of course, in tropics, they don't have cold season. So Bloch was not the right person to have sent this to, given that he was not interested in making tree ring chronologies. So we'll see what happened in a minute. We're back in 1949 on the summit of White Mountain Peak again. Here is a Caltech staff person referring to a White Mountain Observatory. And also we see the Office of Naval Research. This is not the same Lawrence who the Berkeley lab was named for. But we see that the Office of Naval Research was on the summit, and then a year later, we finally gotten past 1950, by 1949. UC takes over the operation of Crooked Creek. As I said, Consolatio and Pace had decided they wanted to build a research station. Pace went to the summit of White Mountain, and that was his choice over Mount Whitney to build the research station. And they also found out that the Office of Naval Research was ready to shut down the Crooked Creek site, and Pace and Consolatio were able to persuade them to write a contract for Pace to operate Crooked Creek for 1 year as a public research station. And they then met with President Sproul, who says, well, that's fine as long as it doesn't cost the university any money. And so Consolatio had the task under this arrangement to come up with $10,000 for the first year of funding for a contract to run Crooked Creek as a public research station. And President Sproul approved, and so this became UC White Mountain Research Station as of September 1st, 1950, which is how we come to be celebrating our anniversary today, as 75 years later. And here is how they did all this bureaucratically. This was Nello's personal research contract. I mentioned it was called Gases, Water, and Electrolytes in the Human Body. But look down at the bottom, and we see Task Order 4D, Operations at White Mountain. So this was adding $10,000 to Nello's personal research contract to run Crooked Creek for a year. Now, Consolatio writes in his autobiography that after they met with President Sproul, he went back to his job at the Office of Naval Research, and one day he was commiserating. He had run out of money for the fiscal year, and he was commiserating with his friend across the hall, who had an office across the hall, who ran the Office of Materials Science. And his friend said, well, I just happen to have $10,000 of year-end money. Year-end money being simply money he was going to have to give back because they hadn't managed to allocate it during that fiscal year. So he agreed to just transfer it over to Consolatio, and Consolatio said it was a miracle because then the lawyers who have to approve this sort of thing agreed, and so all of a sudden he had his $10,000, and This was the $10,000 used to set up Crooked Creek as a public research facility. Now, I don't know anything about these amendments to the Office of Naval Research contracts at the time, but my sense is they were pretty broad, because it would seem like running a research station at 10,000 feet is a kind of a pretty broad interpretation of Nello's original contract. But this, now, we don't have any more written records, but we have kind of looking back at this past tense. The contract was renewed for a 3-year period under the pre-existing terms, which is to say, running Crooked Creek, by consent of both Office of Naval Research and the University Administration, and they've diverted the funds to, instead of using it to just run Crooked Creek for 3 years, expand the station rather than merely maintain it. And so this is the origin of Barcroft. He took money that was delegated for simply running Crooked Creek for 3 more years, and he used it to build Barcroft. And again, I don't know if that's accidental or not, because there's no paper trail of these negotiations to do this, but somehow it happened, and UC bought into it, and ONR bought into it. So now Nello had funding to build another facility. And now the question is, how do you do it? He was a physiologist, and this is where we see his bureaucratic genius. The photo here is of the Office of Naval Research Reserve, Unit 2. And Nello was the commanding officer of that. And we can see this guy right here is Bert Pace, who also wrote up reminiscences, and he's the only reason that we even know this. He wrote about Nello recruiting people to join the Naval Reserve, and he said he was offered a summer in the mountains at a Navy officer's pay. And when he joined his unit, he discovered there were women in it, and there were also people with no military training at all. Actually, Bert had been in the Navy during World War II. He was Nello's grad student, but then this guy obviously wasn't an officer. But this was Nello's Naval Reserve Unit, and this became the construction crew to build Barcroft, or at least that was Nello's first idea. Apparently didn't work very well because of hypoxia. Again, Bert Vaughn wrote, ONR's idea was to support basic research, making creative use of surplus military equipment. By today's standards, probably go to jail for this. And I'm not sure why not. Okay, here we go. So here's a few more slides here. Slides. Again, Bert Vaughn wrote, I don't know how many Navy officers have dug trenches and pickaxed rock outside a military prison. And this is a shot of the slab at Barcroft. And now we can see them putting up the frame of the Ponce hut. And there is a lot of tension. Bert Vaughn wrote, Bob, who is the engineer Nello had hired, who was apparently fresh out of grad school, Bob treated us like day laborers and managed to make our lives miserable, while we, hockey team of World War II vets, undoubtedly made his life just as miserable. Now, what made it worse was this. I came across these photos, and look at the caption. It says 24-hour shifts. And I realized these are photos at night, with light, artificial light lighting up the place. And so they were not only had to deal with hypoxia from 12,500 feet, but some of them were working night shifts. And this is how Nello described it. At 12:05, physical exertion becomes difficult for the very reason establishment here and operates against those constructing it. Nello noted a pronounced mental depression developed in most individuals after a few days, which made it difficult to continue the construction effort. So this is Nello's way of describing what Bert Boyne just described as them, making their, the cocky group of World War II vets making life miserable for the supervisor. Now, they actually managed to finish the framing of the place. By summer's end, according to Bert Bourne, most of the crew were so fed up they never came again. And then, this is my favorite, the photo on the right. It says they were so fed up, they took 3 sticks of C3, the military explosive, and blew up the outhouse. But as far as I can tell, that's what we see here. And here we see Bob Choate, who's the engineer's revenge, from White Mountain Summit. He left a limerick. Here's to White Mountain Peak, strong and rugged compared to the leak. Of the latter we're filled, PhDs didn't fill the bill, and real men I'll continue to seek. So that's Bob Choate's. Now we see October 1951, Barcroft officially was opened. Here's a clipping from the Register. And if you look at this photo, we'll see this again shortly. And those are 2 limber pines, and that's Crooked Creek, down the living quarters down there. But after just a month or so of Barcroft being open, we get this shortwave radio transmission of Berkeley. No food, no equipment, quitting. So that's not good. And we can look at the weather reports from that time and see that a blizzard had come in about 3 days before, and it had snowed continuously. And that's Elmer Bulow, who's a civilian staff member on the left. And so he ran out of food and equipment and ended up driving the bulldozer that they had up there down to Crooked Creek. And when they got this message, this is all that Crooked Creek, that Nello ever wrote about this. The Inyo Register had 3 articles detailing the adventures of Elmer Bulow driving his bulldozer down to Crooked Creek and then joining up at Crooked Creek with the other staff members, who then took a weasel, which is a tracked vehicle, down to Bishop to get supplies. And then when they drove it back up to Crooked Creek, they lost a tread, which apparently was happening all the time then. And so they were stranded at the mine, what's the name of the mine at Sherman Grove? The Mexican mine. So they took refuge there. And then Nello and Bert Vaughn, who is the guy on the right here again, his grad student, drove from Berkeley and brought with them their own weasel. And Nello tried to drive up in this weasel, but he didn't have any luck either. So they finally got Caltrans to plow the road up to the Mexican mine and rescue everybody. And nobody was seriously hurt. But you'll notice that Nello gets the credit in this newspaper article here. They could have had the headline being, Nello Pace jeopardizes the life of his staff by not providing ample supplies. But no, this is Nello's gift. He takes credit. And now we're still in July 1949. Again, this is the shot looking down at the living quarters of 2 limber pines. But, forgot this one was here. This was a Navy press release. And from 1951, when they had just finished building Barcroft. But 1951, the things are very bleak. Barcraft had been abandoned, I just mentioned that. You know, Elmer Buell had abandoned it during the winter because he ran out of food. All Office of Naval Research funds were all spent, and there was no UC funding, because remember that President Sproul only okayed the contract on the provision that UC didn't have to provide any money. And White Mountain had no place in the UC hierarchy because of that. It was Nello's personal research project as a contract amendment to his own personal research project. And funding for White Mountain Road improvement, which was his top priority, was rejected because White Mountain cannot show that it is a permanent facility. So things looked pretty bleak in 1951. But then 1952, Edmund Shulman sent this letter to Nello saying, oh, I saw the photo showing bristlecone pines, and that was interesting because he's looking for old pine trees in the west. And so that led then to Shulman coming to Crooked Creek and starting to sample bristlecones there. Okay. This was that same photo again, but of course those are limber pines. But in this caption here, they get called bristlecones. And this is what brought Shulman to Crooked Creek, where he then started his sampling in the White Mountains. And the rest, as they say, is history. Oops. Okay, and here we see in 1953, he credits Nello with that article here in this footnote in his first article in which he mentions bristlecone pines. Okay, and just a few more slides here. This is from 1955, just to remind you all that, first of all, look at the letterhead. It's the University of California, but it's also a site, the Office of Naval Research, National Science Foundation, and the Rockefeller Foundation. So when White Mountain was set up, it had 3 different funding sources that they were all 3 contributing 1/3 each. And they all 3, unfortunately, had different fiscal years. So it was simply a nightmare to do the accounting. And Nello ended up spending all his money worried about, you know, apportioning these different grants, which all started and ended at different dates. But meanwhile, this also, just by chance, they had built Barcroft at a place where they had line of sight to the nuclear test site, the Nevada test site. And so this is some data in which they are documenting radiation from nuclear tests in 1955, which I thought was kind of mind-boggling to me. They could see the mushroom clouds as well. So finally, I'll stop in the Summit Hut. Nello didn't give up. So in 1955, he got National Science Foundation funding. Of course, Will Consolatio was a big part of this, his friend, to build the Summit Hut. And this shows the Summit Monument that was there before they built. This is the Summit Hut. Here's the plan, and notice that the monument was so big, stone here, that's this, and it was taller than a person here. And it dated to 1888, we learned from the Inland Register. But unfortunately, a few years later, in the 1960s, White Mountain got a helicopter, and they then wanted to have a helipad. So they literally dismantled the monument and built the helipad there. So I think that in conclusion, I'll say, I haven't talked really about the diversity of research that's going on there. What's striking really, when you really look at it, is the spatial scales. They do research and have done it in the past on everything from meter quadrats, looking at soil, the soil moving, putting coins in the ground and watching them literally turn over during the course of the year. Whole summits, landscapes, and temporal scales of hourly, annual, yearly, thousands of years, millions of years, and even light years. Remember that George Smoot got his Nobel Prize after doing about 10 years worth of work at Barcroft, working on his technology. Nello Pace was at the right time, and he knew the right people. You couldn't establish White Mountain Research Station up there now, because it's in the middle of the bristlecone forest, which is rightly preserved. Pace and his colleagues turned a one-year trial contract into a contract to operate Crooked Creek and what is now a 75-year-old facility at Barcroft. And White Mountain is undoubtedly one of the most undervalued resources in the White Mountain system, in the UC system, I should say. Also, Waldo S. Rock, remember him, he could have scooped Schulman by several years in documenting bristlecone longevity, but it's like he chose the wrong research path. He was interested in seeing about these trees in the tropics that produced multiple rings per year, instead of accepting that, okay, it's the cold season that essentially drives the annual rings. Okay, thank you very much. Feel free to ask any questions.
Rain follows the sun.
Pardon me?
The tropics, the rain follows the sun. That continues.
Sounds like it. Well, I don't see anybody snoring, so I'll hold this one.
We got questions over here.
What do you mean by WMRS is one of
Well, Stephen can tell us some of the budgets. Historically, at least when I worked here, there was major budget. And oh, okay, well, even if solved all our problems, I should have no problem.
our budget is the same.
I believe that. I know that's the same projector, so. But it still works, so that's.
Well, maybe with some of the money we raised today, we could purchase some more television.
Oh, that's good.
Small numbers, but enough for us to continue to look at. It's just big, we're part of it.
Well, had I more time, I would have gotten into the irregularity of the funding. That's, now I said that Nello, it was his personal research project initially, and it was only until the late 50s that UC was persuaded to supply some portion of White Mountain's funding, and that's only because Nello went to the Board of Regents and appealed to them, and they agreed to supply a third of it or something, like no more. And but then, because of that, a couple of years later, a retiring UC bureaucrat realized, he was like cleaning out his desk, something like that, realized, wait, that White Mountain Research place, it doesn't have any place, we don't have any way to account for the money that we're giving them. there was no accounting for it.
We're still there.
No, somehow, they, in the sixties,
Oh,
they assigned it to Berkeley.
okay.
They didn't give them more money, but it was still, we'll assign you to Berkeley, but we're only gonna pay 1/3, no more than 1/3 the funding. And then, as later on, they got it to something called the physical MRPP, something like physical plant maintenance. Once they agreed that they had assigned it to Berkeley, then White Mountain had a claim to say, well, since we're part of Berkeley, you have to give us, based on our square footage, physical plant maintenance money. And so that was a big deal. Anyway, so that's, when I say White Mountain has been undervalued, it's been that way for a long time. I mean, and now Stephen gives us good news that maybe it's not.
There's definitely good news involved, there's definitely good news moving forward for sure. And my dad used to say, part of my friends, he said, we make chicken salad out of chicken shit. And I want to say this, is that, yes, there are good things moving forward, and you see it in supporting us, for sure. And
Well, I'm just worried about Trump trying to sue UCLA for $1 billion,
Yeah,
so.
that's a whole nother thing we're
Yeah.
not doing, but I do have a question for you, if you have a second. And you showed those, last photos of the seminar, the old, Karen that was
Yeah,
there, that old.
Yeah,
So, there's been a lot of people who've been talking, and I know you talked about this before, but like, when they built the Summit Hut, and they brought the DC-4 or the DC-9, where they brought up the building, they never had to level the top of it at all. It was fairly a flat summit, like the old pictures before the Summit Hut looked the same before the Summit Hut, right? They didn't like.
no, well, they had that monument was there.
Yes, beside the
Oh.
monument though, but like, it was a flat top, they didn't have to.
Yeah, relatively speaking.
Relatively flat, okay.
Yeah.
That's been a question I get asked a lot, like, did they have to take down a bit of a mountain to build the Summit Hut? And
I don't think so. I think,
judging by that picture.
there's more photos for the construction of the summit where you can kind of see. But no, they didn't, and it was only when the helicopter came that they started dismantling that monument.
And that monument now is the helicopter pad, that's.
Yeah,
to the
basically, that's what it was,
Summit Hut,
Yeah,
Amazing,
yeah.
and,
Do you know what kind of animals were used in research in the Summit Hut?
You name it.
Oh,
In
don't
the
go
summit.
there.
That's sort of a part of the White Mountain history that is not, it's a sensitive subject. Basically, Nello Pace, one of the main goals he had for using Barcroft was to breed laboratory animals. And so he bred them like crazy, and that was at Barcroft. So at the Summit Hut, it was actually human beings. They were people that went out there and acted as guinea pigs on themselves.
Do you know if there were chickens up there?
There were chickens at Barcroft.
Mm-hmm.
I don't
Oh, at
know.
Barcroft,
Yeah, well, definitely at Barcroft and Crooked Creek.
but not up at the summit.
Not sure about the Summit,
Mhm.
just because Summit is so small. And I know it's kind of a horrible story at Crooked Creek, at the Met Hut. You remember I showed a slide of that Quonset hut? They had just set up a chicken breeding program, but they had some kind of device, I think, to keep the chickens warm, to help them hatch the eggs, and it caught on fire. So the whole thing, we had a bunch of roasted chickens. There were probably mice too at that, but that's what happened in 53, 54. And as I said, I don't think they ever took them to the top. But when they finished the Summit Hut, they immediately started getting graduate students up there. There'd be 4 at a time. Yeah, Any more questions?
Daniel, Crooked Creek's about at 10,000, a little more.
Yeah,
When you come up to White Mountain Road, you hit 10,000 at the Shulman Grove.
yeah.
Why did they go another 10 miles over a rough road to be at the same elevation? Do you know why they put it at Crooked Creek and not 10 miles farther south?
Maybe because it was the ridge behind Crooked Creek where they had their Met Hut. And that actually was where they did science And also because they were thinking, remember I showed the slide with those two trailers
Yeah.
that were up at the base of White Mountain Peak? I mean, that was 1948, so I think they were trying to get some place where they could comfortably sleep, but it was as high as they could get, or, you know, so, I mean, they were closer to their work site. If you're gonna work
Closer
up
to
at the
work.
base of White Mountain Peak,
Yeah.
it's less of a draw, less of a commute, from Crooked.
Also, a follow-up question, you showed that, meadow at Crooked Creek,
Yeah.
that later became, what, you know what the transition was caused by? Was it
Well,
grazing? Huh?
it's not, I don't think it's, I think it's, the grazing was a big part of it.
Yeah,
But it's also, I think it was a perched water table to begin with. So, I mean, there was a spring that was flowing year round at Crooked Creek.
Oh.
And I think now, it's been a couple of years since they've had any surface water there.
yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Stephen,
No, you're right, it was just the big one, we had it flowing, it stopped flowing.
Yeah.
So it's pretty wild.
yeah. But I mean, that was basically a big center for sheep herding.
Yeah.
Crooked Creek was. And so in a way, it made sense to camp there because that, basically that's where everybody camped.
Gotcha.
Well,
Yeah, I have kind of a funny story to tell, and it has to do with how, you know, look around here, and so much equipment's been scrounged and got from other places, and, you know, because they were always in
Yeah.
a budget crunch.
yeah,
And it was the early nineties, and Ann and I took part in a physiological experiment at Barcroft. Basically, they wanted to see how you slept at night, and they monitored you. We were free to do what we wanted during the day, but at night, we went in and they'd hook us up with electrodes, and they had this kind of suit you wore. And I remember they'd given me these pants, and they were kind of like bike pants, you know? And I looked at the inside and it had Jay Glenn on it, and I go,
my goodness.
where did these come from? He said, oh, they were from this page, they were John Glenn's. And I go, far out.
That's a story I've
It
never
worked,
heard.
but, yeah, I just thought it was really funny. I go, Jesus.
I've heard that, what's his name, Werner von Braun, the German rocket scientist, reportedly had gone to Barcroft, but I could never find any evidence of it. I looked in all the signature logs and I didn't see that.
Then there was
Take
some,
a look at the underwear.
you didn't look at the underwear. That's-
No, I didn't, that's true, I don't think I want to.
So that fire that happened with
Yeah.
the chickens, is that what burned in that town? Is that the?
Yeah,
that was
yeah,
the
there
one?
are a
We have
couple of
photos
photos
of
of
that.
that, yeah.
That was the actual one that you did, okay.
The White Mountain Whites.
Yeah, that's right. Well, they actually bred them, Dan Cutchell told me that, he was on the staff here. He said that the breeding program went on until, I think sometime in the eighties. And then finally, they ended up donating them to
Dan
the
Cutchell.
Rotary Club or something. Two chickens.
I've heard another question, but what, like, so there's the monkey, at the Barcroft original blueprints, there's the monkey room.
Mhm.
And to the east of it is something on the blueprints that says it's called the incinerator room. But someone told me that it was actually the incubator room, and that this blueprints in the 1970s got it wrong when they did the addition. Was it an incubator room or
I
an
don't,
incinerator?
that's a good question, I don't know. If it was Crooked Creek, it was an incubator room, because that's what set the place on fire. But at Barcroft, I don't know.
Okay, I gotta look back into some.
The other thing at Barcroft, you know, they used to melt snow, they had like
The
a,
snow room.
yeah, the snow room, okay, so
Yeah.
I should look at those plans.
We have the 1970s
Yeah, I
plans
just
over
saw
there,
it.
but we don't have the original 50s plans, but yeah, it's,
Any more questions?
I'm just curious about the rotation between the UCs, who,
It depends on the director.
okay.
So Nello was at Berkeley, and then we had Clarence Hall, who was UCLA, and then Frank Powell, who's UC San Diego, and now we're at UCLA again,
Okay.
through the
Is there,
Institute for,
So-
what is it, Stephen?
IOES,
Yeah,
the Institute of Environment and Sustainability. Yeah.
I just had a question about, so you said they tried out Sheep Mountain as
Yeah,
a place
yeah.
for the station at first. And I know there's
Well, they
like
just took their trailers up there.
okay, yeah, and I've seen this like box,
It's
like
still there?
container up there, is that a remnant from that, or? do you
I'm
know
not
anything
sure
about
where,
it?
there's, the box you're talking about can't be where I took that photo, because you could, I took that photo and there's nothing left there. I think somewhere else on Sheep Mountain, I might have stumbled across that, but I don't know what it was, so I can't.
It's definitely a box that was left from WMRS.
Yeah, I think it was.
It runs closely along the old road, they used to go between the saddle of sheep. And, it's still, the hunters use it as they put preserves and everything, but you can visit it, it's a remnant. But
You know, the other thing is,
Okay.
if you, look on the part of the road between the Barcroft Gate now and Barcroft, to the east, there's an old, what do they call, weasel tire, that no one ever cleaned up.
Really?
Yeah, I found it there, by chance, but anyway, I recognized it immediately, that's gotta be a weasel tire, because they fell off all the time, and that's where they used to drive them, so.
Weasel's an old military.
Yeah, there's, it's a track vehicle,
The treaded vehicle.
yes, sir.
Oh, yeah, you mentioned research that was sponsored by, I believe it was the Lawrence Laboratory there at Berkeley. Have you ever heard of a expedition to the Peruvian Andes that was sponsored by, I believe the Army paid for it, or the Air Force, but it was some educated person that was part of Berkeley up there. But they sent mountaineers to see how they would adjust to altitude. This was 1952, when very little was known about high altitude
No.
sickness.
No,
You're not aware of that? I just thought you might have some.
I know that, the Karma Project makes me think of going to South America, because that's where, you know, the observatory up here they had for a while. They, one of the rivals to that site was the place in South America, but,
Yeah, they
as
picked
far as
some
physiology.
fairly well-known mountaineers to go on this. One of them was Alan Steck, who's passed away.
Yeah, that's my dad.
With Will
Who
Siri.
was your
And
Steck?
Will, Alan Steck.
Oh, really? Alan Steck, yes.
Yeah, and Will Siri, I'm pretty sure was.
Will Siri was the leader,
Yeah,
yeah.
and they had a death.
Yeah, that was guilty, wasn't it? Or,
I can't remember his name.
yeah, one did die of high altitude
Right,
pulmonary edema.
and they didn't make their climb or
They-
anything.
yeah.
They abandoned it.
They did
to
some
get it down.
easy peaks there in the area.
Yeah,
Yeah, one of them was Lee Ortenberger. He
right.
was-
And I
yeah.
think Will Siri was on that too.
Will
He
Siri,
was-
I think, led
Yeah,
it.
Will Siri
one
was
year.
Vanello's buddy's,
Right.
colleague at Donner Lab.
Well, and then I gave you that
Yeah, the
article
article
with,
about your dad.
maybe that was.
It was Oscar
No, it
Cook
seemed
who
like that
died.
was Himalaya.
Yeah.
When Dwayne Bloom was here, he went on everything.
Whatever. Oscar Cook passed away there.
There's still a lot of research like that occurs up at Barcroft. We have a lot of elevation and human physiology. And a lot of these people go to Barcroft and they go to other places down in Chile and Patagonia, and they go to like Himalayas, and so they run their route. And we're fortunate enough to still use Barcroft. They're like, this is the best place you can go. But then we come from Canada, they come from England, but it's so much easier to get to 12.5 for them. So it's still part of a human physiology thing that was part of like.
I wish I knew about this research in 1974, where I got to 22,000 feet on Aconcagua in Argentina before I gave up.
That's 22.
But,
Any more questions? Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.